fall is among us, or will be among us here soon. And for us crafters, it's time to start thinking about what we're going to decorate. And so this next series, we're going to be making this mini quilt. You can either make it as a table runner, like I did here, or a wall hanging, which you can rotate your blocks and have it hanging like this. It's however you want the orientation. We use applique, we embellish it, and we're using a decorative binding stitch. So if you want to learn how to make this adorable fall mini quilt, then stick around. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie with Jackie Russell Creates, where we talk about everything quilting. I hope to inspire you to make traditional patchwork quilts or some art quilts, whether they're big or they're small. So let's get started. So be sure to check out the playlist. It'll be linked in the description below and at the end of each video to be able to see each quilt block being made. And you can also get the pattern. The link is in the description, but it will be up on my Etsy shop. You can get each individual block separate, or you can get the whole quilt pattern as one. So let's get started. In this video, we are going to be making the pumpkin block for our fall sampler. In the pattern, the link is in the description below, we'll have the reverse or mirrored image and the regular, depending on how you're going to do it. If you're going to use your fusible or if you're going to use the wax paper method. You'll want to trace your paper. For this block, you're going to need a 10-inch square or a fat eighth for your pumpkin. For the bird, you're going to need a 6-inch by 8-inch piece of fabric. For the stem, it's just a scrap, and for the leaf, you need a 6-inch square. And then you need coordinating thread to match. You'll also need your heat and bond or wax paper, whatever you're going to use. In the pattern, you will get the full picture to show out where to lay the pieces as well as the individuals. It will also show you where to put the bird's eye and the feet. So now you're going to take your pattern and you're going to trace it onto the paper side of your fusible. There is enough space in the pattern for you to overlap. I am using the mirrored version to transfer onto my paper side of my heat and bond. Then you're going to loosely or roughly cut around the edges, not on the lines, on the outside of them. Now you want to fuse it to the back side of your fabric. I love using batiks here because you can use either side. And you need to follow the instructions that come with whatever fusible that you are using. each one is a little different. You need to let it cool for a few seconds, and then you need to cut it out along the lines. Now we're going to position our pattern onto our 12.5-inch block, and you can see where I start with the outside pieces first, which will be 1 and 5, and then you lay down your 2 and 4, and then the center one. I like to tack the bottom of them just a little bit so it will stay in place as I lay the rest down. They do overlap about 1/4 inch or so. So then when you do your stitching, you can get both the pieces attached down. Now we're going to attach the stem and just kind of slide it down underneath the pumpkin pieces how you would like it to be. And then we're going to iron or press these into place. I use a up and down motion, not a swishing motion. And I have the iron on there for a couple of seconds. Make sure it's fully tacked down. I let that cool for a little bit, a couple seconds, just to make sure I don't over tack or overheat. And then we're going to position the rest. Now here, if you can't get the fusible backing off or the paper off the backing, you can use a straight pin and score it, and it will leave a mark in there, and you can be able to bend it and open it. You want to position your wing on top of your bird. There is a pattern that you can reference in the pattern as well. And then you want to put on your leaf and tack them down. You want to make sure that your edges you leave about 1/4 inch or a little more so you don't get them in on the stitching and clip them. Make sure you do that on the top, the bottom, and the 2 sides when you're positioning your pumpkin and bird details in your block. Once you have the bird and the leaf in your position, you want to make sure you tack them down with the iron as well. If you didn't want to do the stitching on the applique, you could use the Heat and Bond Ultra, which is in the red package, and you don't have to do the stitching. We're going to let this cool a little bit, and then we're going to do the stitching around it. I like to do the blanket stitch around the outsides and then a little detail in the centers. So I'm going to start with the stem, and I'm using a coordinating yellow thread. I'm going to do the blanket stitch, and on the inside, to give a little more dimension and depth to the stem, I'm going to use a wavy line. Here you can see where I'm showing what colors of thread I'm using. I'm using a green with the leaf, some tan for around the pumpkin and the inside of the pumpkin, and then of course black for the bird.
So as you see here, I took a piece of scrap fabric, and this is just so I can make my stitch length and stitch width the way I want it before I put it on my actual project. Once I get it to where I like it, I bring in my project, and I will bring my needle down right even with the fabric on the outside edge so I can begin stitching, and it's right where I need it to be. So I'm going to take my time and go slowly around the curve, taking my time. If I need to, I will lift up the presser foot and just adjust it just a slight bit, but most of the time that's only around a really steep curve, like along the stem or the leaf lines.
Okay, now that we have the stem all done, we need to go and stitch the bird. Or you can stitch the leaf. I think I'm going to start with the leaf. And it's going to get stitched all the way around. So we need to switch out the bobbin. To me, this is the fun part of these appliques because you're able to add your stitch thread or your thread stitching or details in it, and it makes it so much fun. I mean, the image actually comes to life, you know, when you start adding all that detail in. You know, picking your thread to match or contrast, whether you know you want it coordinating or you want it contrasting. So I'm going to start up here at the tip and just work my way around. So I'm going to position the needle right along the edge of the applique. Once again, taking your time. You could also hand stitch this if you wanted to hand stitch it. You know, while you're sitting and watching TV at night. So I'm just going to take my time around the corners. And now I'm just going to pivot a little bit, stitch, pivot, because these are a sharp curve. Come down to the point and pivot. So I'm going to finish stitching around this leaf. And then I'm going to do some veins through the center. When I came down to that point, I made sure that when the next stitch was to come over into the fabric, so then I could be able to turn it and it would come into the fabric and stitch down that corner. I know there's a tip or trick or something to do, but I just watch my thread and how it's being positioned on how to lift it up and rotate my fabric. So now that the leaf is all stitched, you could be done here, but I'm going to add some detail to this. So I'm going to go to my waving line or stitch. Going to bring my foot down near the bottom, and I'm going to wave up through a vine up through the center here. You could also do a straight stitch if you wanted. Now I'm also going to bring some up into these other. So I'm going to position my needle on the thread or stitch that's already there. So there is the stem and the leaf. I'm going to now do the bird and the pumpkin. For the bird, you're going to go around the wing first, and then you're going to come, if you're using the same color thread, this is how I would do it. I would start at the wing here, go around the bird, come up around the wing, and continue around. Then you can do it all in one. If you're going to use different stitches or different color thread for each one, then I would do the wing first and then the bird. But because I'm doing all black, I'm going to go around there. And then I'm going to come do the pumpkin. And for the pumpkin, I would start up here and I would go around, skip that part of the bird, and go all the way around, skip this leaf, do this little bit and this little bit. And then I would cut it off and then come in and do each of the inside pieces. So I'm going to finish stitching this down, and then I'll come back to finish the bird, the eye on the bird, and the feet. Well, here is the finished block. Almost. We have to do the feet and we have to do the eye. So for the feet, you can machine stitch down or you can hand stitch them. And for the eye, you can add a little button. You can add a French knot. I'm going to add a little bead here. And I'm going to probably hand stitch his feet down. And then I just wanted to show you the back so you can see point. So let's get what we need to finish up this block. There, we have completed our first block. We added a bead eye and his feet. So now we can just set this block aside. We are going to work on our sunflower block. And this is just my paper template that I use to do my designing, but we're going to turn this into a cute little block to go with our fall sampler. Whether you do it as a wall hanging or a table runner. So let's get started. You're going to need about an 1/8 yard of some yellow fabric. I did 2 different styles of yellow just to give some dimension to the sunflower, but you could use all one color. For the center, you're going to need a 5-inch square to cut out your centerpiece. And then for the leaves, you're just going to need some scraps. They're not very big. And then of course you're going to need some thread to coordinate with your material. And then you're going to need a 12.5-inch square for your background. For my thread, I'm using a yellow, a tan, and obviously a green. You will also need some seed beads, or what's called, I think, rock beads. That's what I'm using today, is some rock beads. They're going to be the little seeds inside the center of our sunflower. So head on over and let's get started. So the first thing I did is I took one of my leaves of my pattern and then I traced it onto a cutting mat, one of them flexible cutting mats from Dollar Tree, and then traced it out. So this is going to give me my template. It is a little more sturdier and easier to trace around than the paper. You're going to need 22 of these little petals. So that's one of the reasons I did it right onto this flexible cutting mat. And what you're going to do is you're going to trace it onto the paper side of your heat and bond light. There is going to be the normal, so you see it this way, and then I'm going to have the reverse. So depending on if you're using wax paper or fusible, I like to use the heat and bond. That's just what I use. So so you trace it onto the paper side of the heat and bond, and then you're going to roughly cut them out, leaving some space around. Then you're going to iron that onto your wrong side of your fabric. And then when you do that, you're going to cut it out directly on that line. And then that's going to give you your shape for the sunflower petals, or whatever you're putting on. And then I pulled out my silicone mat, and you're going to put your design underneath, and then you can be able to see through. And I do this when I have lots of little pieces, so then I can just line everything up on the mat. And so my mat's got a little stick to it, so I can press down my pieces and it will stick to the mat just a little bit, just to hold it down until I can iron it. So then I'm just going to take, I just have a needle here. You can take a straight pen, and I'm just going to score it across the paper part, and that just gives a little slit that just makes it so much easier to pull off that backing. And I'm going to position that petal there. And then I'm going to do the same thing. You're going to need 2 leaves and then a center. So I'm going to go ahead and take the center off, paper off, and we're going to just position this over the petals. Here it is. Take my wax paper and put on top so I don't get any stuff onto my iron. And we're just going to press that down. And so it's going to stick to the fabric. It won't stick to my mat, which makes it really nice. So we'll let that cool here for a minute. Just let that cool. We'll move this paper out and bring in our fabric. Then this, all we have to do is peel it up, and it should come up in one. Let me stick this. Didn't quite stick here. It will pull up into one piece. Take it slow and gentle. There we go. I can move my mat out of the way now. And then we're just going to position this kind of in the center. I'm just going to eyeball it. You just want to make sure that you have a 1/4 inch or more on each side for your seam allowance. So that looks pretty good to me. We're going to press it in place, and now it will fuse to our background fabric. I will also have an SVG in the pattern that will be listed in the description. If you have a cutting system, and you can be able to cut out the shapes right onto your fabric. Just making sure I have all the pieces adhered. And you'll just want to follow the instructions that come with whatever fusible you're using. Each one's a little different. And now we're going to let it cool, and now we're ready to go over to the sewing machine to start stitching these pieces down. I think I'm going to start with the center piece, for one, because that's the color of thread I have in my machine right now. But go around the center, and I'm not going to do anything on the inside, but you could actually, do a spiral if you wanted to I'm not doing anything on the inside because I'm going to be putting some of these rock beads in the center. And then you'll just go around each of the petals. I'd probably start with the ones on the top first, the first layer, and then work my way down the rest. Make sure you're hitting everyone. And then in the center of each of these front petals, I'm going to take and do some little curve type pieces. And then on the leaves, you can do some vines. So let's head over to the sewing machine and get started. So here we are at the sewing machine. I'm going to do a blanket stitch, and I'm going to take just a scrap piece of fabric and test it and see if I like the width and the dimensions, the length and the width. I would rather do it on a scrap piece of fabric than on my actual pattern. So I just do a couple stitches. I think that looks good. And so we'll get started. We are doing a circle. So you'll want to take your time. And what I do is I take and I use my roller on the side and bring my needle down right next to the edge, outside edge of the fabric. And just take it slow around the curve. I'm letting the feed dogs pull the fabric in, and I'm just rotating it every so slightly around the center. Now I'm going to switch out to my yellow thread. You could actually do any stitch around here. You can do a straight stitch, you can do a zigzag stitch, any other decorative stitches that you may have on your machine. I just like the way the blanket stitch looks. So I'm just going to find a place to start. I'm going to bring my needle down. Right to the outside edge and just start stitching. When I get to the tips, that's a stronger curve. I just kind of watch how my needle goes and just so slightly rotate around that curve. And because some of the pieces are so close together, I'm not going to cut my thread. I'm just going to move to the next location, bring my needle down, and start. Make sure to tack at the beginning and end, depending on what stitch you use. So I'm going to finish stitching around the leaves, and I'll come back and show you what I do on the center, and then we'll finish up with those leaves. Well, here we are doing the leaves. So on the inside of my top sunflowers, I just did a wavy line on a couple wavy lines in each of those petals, and I just made it as big as I can make it on my machine. And I just did halfway up the petal. So now we're going to do the blanket stitch on the leaves. You can also hand stitch this if you want. If you didn't want to do any stitching, you could use the Heat and Bond Ultra. You could also do a very dense quilting if you didn't want to do the applique stitch, but that just means you would really have to make sure that you got all those edges in your quilting. So like I said, a very heavy, dense quilting. And then from here, I'm just going to go to a straight stitch and stitch some vines. Up the leaves. You can also do free motion quilting if you wanted. Making sure just to cut off all the end pieces. So when I just backstitch back down the stitch I was on and then pivot to do the side veins. So there we go. We have all the stitching done. It's kind of hard to see on the petals where I did the wavy lines, but I just kind of did them right in here just to give some texture. And now it is time to do the detail in the center. So I'm going to take my tan thread or whatever you use to do the center and my needle, and we're going to tie a knot in the ends, and we're just going to randomly place some of these beads throughout the center, and mine are all different shapes. They're kind of like rock beads. So I'm just going to come up the hole. Let's hope my needle will go through them. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, we are back. And all I'm doing is I'm going up just randomly, wherever the needle wants to go, I guess. Grabbing a bead, putting it on, and going back down as close as to that same hole as I could or can. And then just pull it tight. Come back up in a different spot. Go back down as close as you can. And just keep randomly all the way around inside your sunflower. You could use seed beads for this. You can tie French knots if you wanted to. Just make sure you don't get your corners in. I've done that before. The nice thing with the beads that I'm using is they're all different shapes and sizes. There's no per se, 2 beads that are the same. Some are flat, some are skinny. You have small triangles. You can put as many as few as you would like in. So I'm going to tie off this thread, and I just going to, because it's long enough, I'm just going to tie it through the back. Just going to add a couple knots. That'll help secure it in place. And I'm going to finish tying on these beads. I would only put the beads on if you plan on not washing, or if you're going to hand wash. I wouldn't send them through a regular cycle on a washing machine. So there is our sunflower block all ready to be put in our quilt, our mini quilt top. So wouldn't that make a cute little even a placemat, or added into a quilt? We are going to be doing the acorn block with the fall berries coming up out of the background. We're going to be doing some hand stitching, some applique, and some decorative stitching. I think that's about it. You're going to need background fabric, this 12.5-inch square. For the acorn top and the acorn bottom, you can do however you would like. You are going to need a 6-inch square for each piece. This piece I actually fussy cut. I laid my template on there to get the design right where I wanted it. And then for the leaves, you're going to just need some scraps. Well, it's looking like a 12-inch square, just enough that you can get some leaves on. I did 2 different colors. You could do the same color. And then you're going to need some red beads. I'm using beads from the dollar store. And then matching thread. So, hello and welcome. My name is Jackie with Jackie Russell Creates, where we talk about everything quilting. I hope to inspire you to make traditional patchwork quilts and some art quilts, whether they're big or they're small. So with that, let's get started. So to get started on this, you just need the acorn template and the leaf template. And what you're going to do is you're going to take your template, you're going to trace it on the paper side of your heat and bond. In the pattern, you'll have it where it's normal, and then it's going to be also mirrored images. So depending on if you're doing heat and bond or if you're doing the wax paper method, you will have both of them. Then you iron it onto the back side of your fabric after you've cut out roughly around the shape. That way you don't waste much of your heat and bond. And now we're going to just cut it out along the lines for our shape. And once we have all our shapes cut out, then we're going to lay our design out. I like to lay it out kind of with the paper backing so I can kind of see. But to remove the paper backing, I'm just going to score it. That's just the needle that I'm going to be using later on. So you're just going to score it. By scraping across there, you can see it's just going to give it a little rip or tear in there that you can easily pick up, and then you don't have to fight with the paper backing on the edge to get it to start. Just a simple little technique there, little tip. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of lay this out. I know the acorn's going to be on top of the leaves. I want to make sure that I'm leaving 1/4 of an inch or more along the edge here. But I also want to make sure I have my enough room for my berries. You can use a light box for this. I think I like that design. Something like that. Then I'm going to get my freezer paper and put it over the top so I don't get any stuff on my iron. We're going to press it. Make sure that you're going with the instructions per your fusible that you're using. Just making sure all the little fingers of the leaves are attached down. If you didn't want to do the applique, you can use Heat and Bond Ultra. Then you don't have to stitch around it. Okay, we're going to let that cool here for a minute. And then I'm going to take it to the machine and we're going to do a blanket stitch around all the pieces. And then on the leaves, I'm going to do some veins coming up just with a plain straight stitch. I'm going to start with the leaf, the green leaf, because that's the thread I have in my machine. So let's go to the machine and start stitching.
For some reason this did not record, but you're going to trace the berries on, and then we're going to take it over and stitch them.
Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see. You just come up. I have it knotted, 2 strands. You're going to go make a straight stitch. And I just pull it through. I go down that same stitch. Give me a little bit of space. Pull it through. It's a back stitch. And that's just how I'm going to do the vines. When I get to the top of the stem, I'm going to add a bead. You can also put this in a hoop if it keeps getting hung up or you see that you're pulling your stitches too tight. You don't want to pull them too tight that it puckers up, but you don't want to have them too loose either. So I'm just going to keep going up this main stem, go down in the back and come up in the front. And because these are straighter stitches, you're able to make them a little longer than you would if you're going around a curve. You can also hand or machine stitch this with a straight stitch if you wanted. You can also do it with the free motion if you would like. I just enjoy being able to hand stitch a little bit here. And I'm just kind of using the pin marking as a guide to have somewhat straight stitches. But as we all know, no branch is perfectly straight, so it's okay if it's not. So I'm going to finish stitching this, and we'll be back for the final review. So here is our finished block, the last one in this series. We are going to assemble and finish our either wall hanging or table runner that we did with our little applique of our sunflower, our pumpkin, and our acorn. So if you're ready to see this project get finished and put together, then stick around. So what you need to do is decide how you're going to orient your blocks. I'm going to do a table runner, and so I want mine going sideways like that. If you're doing a wall hanging, you may want them to go up and down like this. So depending on how you're doing it, depends on how the next step goes, but it's the same concept. So I know I want the sunflower, then the bird and pumpkin, and then the acorn. So now we're going to put sashing around the blocks. So you're going to need 4 pieces that are 1.5 by 12.5, and they're going to go along. If you're doing the table runner and you have it oriented like mine, they're going to go along the side. If you're doing a wall hanging and they're going up and down, then they're going to need to go at the top and the bottom. So that's the only thing that's going to be, per se, different. So I'm going to sew these on using a 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to pin mine, and I'm going to do the chain stitching where I'm just going to run them all through the machine at one time, or well, right after each other, but without cutting my thread. This last block is going to get 2, I'm going to sew them both on, and then when I press them open, I'll press toward the sashing area and then sew them all together. I would love to see how you put your pattern together. You can join my Facebook community if you would like, and that just is in the description below. But it is also just Facebook, and it's groups. Jackie Russell Creates is my page, and then my group is Jackie Creates Community. So I would love to have you over there where you can share what you're making. And it does not even have to be quilt base. If you're a cross stitcher or an embroider, crochet, you can share any of your projects that you do. You can also ask for some input, advice. We all like to share and help each other out. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew these together. So now I'm going to just pin the blocks together and finish adding the sashing, and then I'll go to the iron and iron the seams toward the sashing. Now that it has the sashing through there, we're going to put some sashing on the top and the bottom, or if you're doing it the other way, it would be down the sides. So the long part, which you'll need to cut a 1.5 inch by 40, 1.5 by 40.5 inch long piece to go to the top and the bottom. So what I like to do, I like to start at one end. I'm going to pin this corner, and I'm going to pin this corner, making sure that my strip is not twisted. Then I'm going to fold it in half and find the center of both the sashing and the block. And I just put my finger in there kind of like that. so I know where it's at. And then I just hold it, open it up, make sure the edges are straight, and put a pin. Then I work my way in filling in between the pins. This just assures that everything is lined up, measured correctly, and fits in there nicely. So we did the first, between the first two pins. Now we're going to do the second half at the top, and then we're just going to repeat it along the other edge. And so that at 1/4 inch, and then we're going to press it toward the sashing. So I'm going to finish that up, and then we'll be on to the next step. Now that we have our sashing done, we need to work on the outer border. The outer border is just a checkered border. And what I did is I just took and cut strips of my background fabric, which is this tan, and then I just took the scraps of the pieces that I used in each block, and I cut them at 2.5 by 2.5 square, and then we sewed them together. You could also do it in strips, like if you had a longer piece, like this green, I had a longer piece, so I just kept it as one strip and then cut them into the blocks and then lay the blocks out. So we're going to finish this one block here. If you're going to do them individually like I did here, you need to press all seams toward the dark fabric, not your background fabric, all toward the dark fabric. That way, when you put them together and you flip them so you can get the checkerboard, the seams are going to nestle up with each other, and then you're able to just stitch straight down that way. And then when you stitch them together, it's going to be they're going every other direction on the back, so that it will lay flat and have less bulk when we start to do our quilting. So I'm going to nestle those seams up, make sure I'm sewing them the right way. Nestling the seams up, you can pin. I just go to the sewing machine and just stitch. And when I did the strips, I just did chain piecing. So I'd put 2 together, stitch them 2 together, but I had them laid out so I knew which was like the next one. So now we're going to add this last piece to this strip, nestling up those center seams, and you're able to fill them, and then make sure your corners match and sew it. If you're doing the exact measurements as the pattern, you're going to need 2 strips that are going to go down the short sides, which are going to be 7 blocks, but it's going to measure at 14.5 by 4.5. And they're going to go on each side. You can lay them however you want, whatever directions. I think. So this one I am going to pin the same way as I did the sashing. I'm going to go corner to corner. It's a little easier to find the center of the smaller pieces. You know, you really just can give it a little tug and make sure that everything's lined up. I like to pin along the seams, and I just put a few pins in to help hold that in place. Do this one the same on this side. And this one, because I have orange down here, I'm putting the orange up at the top. You can lay them out however you would like. You could actually make these a solid border if you want. So how is the weather where everybody's at? We are hot here. We're hitting 100 degrees. And we actually have a heat index, which is very odd for Wyoming. We normally don't have heat index. Very, very hot. No humidity, which we very seldom hit 100 degrees anyways, but we've been hitting high hundreds, or not high hundred, but 104, 107. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch down this border to the main project, and then when you iron it, you're going to iron it toward the sashing. There we have our border on the short sides, and now we have to do the border along our long side. I wanted to have a corner piece, so I cut these at 4.5 by 4.5. You'll need 4 of them, and then you're going to sew them to each end of the border, which this border measures 40.5 by 4.5. So then when we attach this, the checkered will line up even with the sashing, and then it will just be the corner block with the outside border. You can continue this so it's just one continue of the checkered board. It's your whatever you prefer. So I'm going to attach the corner pieces to the border and then attach it to the main piece. You can pin if you'd like. I like to at least put one pin when it's a little longer in at the end. And because I'm chain piecing, I am going to pin the rest of them in both corners. And when I iron this, I will iron it toward the corner piece. So now we're going to just attach them. And because I want to make sure that this lines up, they should nestle, because we ironed this toward the sashing and this toward the corner block. They will nestle right there, and I'm going to pin those so I know that that's where it's supposed to be. I'm going to pin the corner, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other end, making sure that my border don't get twisted. I'm going to nestle these seams and put a pin in there, and then I'm going to find that center again by folding it in half. But this time I'm going to kind of line up these seams where the border is, because we know that that's even. And I'll put my finger in there and line it up. I'm going to open it, and then I'm going to pin it. And then I'm going to work my way to the other end, or to both ends, making sure it all eases in and the way it's supposed to be. And normally I work from end to end, like you just saw I put a pin down this way and then I move to the other, to the center. That just kind of helps line everything up. In my opinion, that's what's easier for me. So I just did it to center. I'm going to bring it down this way and line up the edge and put a pin in there. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, matching up those seams. You're able to feel, once they nestle, you'll be able to feel them in there. Pin the end of the corner, making sure not to twist. And I'm going to nestle these seams. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to hem it or sew it at a 1/4 inch. And then I will press toward the sashing, and our top will be done. You can quilt it however you would like to have it quilted. I am going to do quilting in the ditch around the border, down the sashing. Well, I guess it's kind of in the ditch. It's going to be real close to the seam, but it's going to be on that just a little bit out. And then to hold my blocks in place, I'm going to just stitch around the outside of the applique. The pattern will be in the description. It's on my Etsy shop. You will be able to get each individual block as an individual pattern if you don't want the whole set, or you can get the whole pattern, which is all 3 blocks and the border. So I'm going to go take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew these and iron, and I'll be back in a few. There you have it, the finished top. Now you can quilt it however you want. I am going to quilt along this edge of each block. I'm also going to quilt just around the edge, outside edge of the applique. And then in the border, I'm going to stitch around each little block. So I'm going to go ahead and go quilt that, and then I'll be back to show how I'm going to bind it, because I'm going to use a decorative stitch to bind this quilt, mini quilt. So now we're doing the binding, and I'm doing it with a decorative stitch. I have it on the leaf that I have on my machine. So I just did a regular binding where I attach it to the front here and then flip it over to the back. And normally you would stitch in the ditch or you would hand stitch it. Well, we're going to do a decorative stitch to attach it down. You prepare your binding just like you normally would. Clamp it or clip it. Set your decorative stitch on how you want, and then I'm just taking the center, my binding to the center, so it's attaching on the binding and then partway on the quilt, and just letting the machine do its stitch. And I chose to use yellow thread so it stands out just a little bit, but it's not like in your face bold. So I'm not for sure if you can see as it's coming through the back of the machine, but I will take a close-up of it when I'm done. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and let me know what you would use yours for if you're not doing the whole series. Also, if you're new here and you feel like sticking around, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you know the next time that I upload a video. I upload most Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and we love to quilt. So until then, happy quilting, my friends.